Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marshall Building at the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Minouche Shafik, and I am the President and Vice Chancellor of the London School of Economics. This evening, we're going to be discussing Dr. Adam Oliver's new book, A Political Economy of Behavioural Public Policy, which has been recently published by Cambridge University Press. It tackles one of the big debates in behavioural public policy, which is how paternalistic should the state be? Those on the right tend toward a more libertarian view on this question. Those on the left have a tendency to advocate greater state intervention in the public interest. Adam navigates an approach which is grounded in the liberal tradition, and I will let him describe that in greater detail. After we hear from him, we have a fantastic panel who are going to reflect on this big question of the political economy of behavioural public policy, and I will introduce them after Adam speaks. Let me start, though, by introducing Adam. He's an associate professor in the Department of Social Policy here at LSE. He's also the founding co-editor of the journal Behavioural Public Policy and founder of the International Behavioural Public Policy Association and the annual International Behavioural Public Policy Conference. He's also the author of the book that we are discussing tonight, A Political Economy of Behavioural Public Policy, which is part of a trilogy of work that he has been doing around this issue. Adam, over to you.
I'll stand next to the mic. Okay, thanks everybody for coming tonight. I just wanted to speak for maybe 5 minutes, just to outline what I think are the main messages in this book that I've, Minouche says it's been recently published. It's not actually published until February the 23rd. I tried to get it published in time for this book launch, but it's been put back a week. But it will be published on February the 23rd, so I know you'll all be excited about ordering your copy of 30% discount on the leaflets right in front of you. So this is the third book in a trilogy, as Minouche has highlighted. Where I've tried to convey what I think are the origins, the development, and my perspective on the future of this new, relatively new, and yet now very large subfield of public policy generally, I think. My approach in the book, it's kind of got two arms to it, really, and it differs. It differs from the dominant paternalistic approach that's so far sort of been present within the field. I mean, as most of you, or many of you would know, I think the field has been dominated really by what's called soft forms of paternalism over the last 15 years now or so. And yet there's been recently, I think, a rise in the number of people who are thinking about a liberal approach, a more liberal approach to the field as the field moves forward. Personally, I think that's going to be one of the big debates as the field moves forward. Do we continue with this paternalistic sort of strategy, or do we move towards a more liberal strategy? So, the perspective I'm coming at in the book is that the paternalists, the people that have adopted a paternalistic approach, have generally believed that the behavioural influences, or sometimes called the behavioural biases, cause people to make decisions that conflict with what they really want to do, conflict with their own self-interest, in a sense. My perspective is in terms of behavioural economic findings, is that these are perhaps ecologically rational. That is to say that these behavioural affects seem to lie so deep within human beings, then if they are causing us to make mistakes in our decision-making, why did we evolve in those ways? So for me, individuals, all of us, probably have desires in life that are multifarious and differ from one another. And the behavioural affects, these things that have been labelled behavioural biases, these heuristics or rules of thumb, may be leading us in directions that help us to satisfy our own personal desires in life. Right? Now, A qualifier to that is that reciprocal instincts, people's propensity to give and take, and negative reciprocity to punish people that are undertaking acts that are considered to be, in some sense, objectionable. These reciprocal instincts lie very deep within individuals. And I think they've probably developed, and this is in line with what many scholars write, going back to David Hume at least, developed because they enable us to better follow our own personal desires in life. That is to say, if we're cooperating with each other, even though individually we might have different desires, those levels of cooperation might help all of us to better reach our own personal desires in life. And yet, the reciprocal instincts, the cooperative endeavours, are very easy, it seems, to crowd out with incorrect with what may be considered to be incorrect institutional designs. So to me, we need to think about designing our institutions, our environments, so that we nurture and not crowd out these reciprocal instincts, these cooperative endeavours. Right? Very, very easy to crowd out. They're often very strongly endogenously affected. Right? So, that's my first arm of behavioural public policy, really, is that we should be trying to give people a great deal of autonomy, but recognising that our structures of our society ought to be nurturing these deep reciprocal instincts. However, my second arm of behavioural public policy is that when you afford people a great deal of autonomy, there will be, of course, many people, at least some people, that act upon their egoistic instincts. Opportunities for egoistic actions are kind of strengthened, if you like, if you give people a great deal of individual autonomy. And it's my belief, I suppose, that some of those opportunities will use essentially the behavioural biases, or what have been labelled the behavioural biases, the behavioural affects, to manipulate other people into actions that they don't really want to undertake for the first party's self-interest. So it's essentially imposing harms on other people. It's not a paternalistic direction, it's a concern with externalities. And there will be situations, therefore, whereby we might decide to regulate against those activities if we think that they've passed some kind of threshold of acceptability. So that's what I've called behaviourally informed regulation, or budge approach rather than the nudge approach to public policy. In the first arm of my behavioural public policy, my political economy of behavioural public policy, I think I was kind of heavily influenced by David Hume. He was probably influenced a bit by me as well, really. So David Hume. And in the second arm of my behavioural public policy is kind of like the no harm principle of J.S. Mill. So when I've developed this kind of political economy of behavioural public policy, I think I've been very heavily influenced, not only by many of the people around us here, some of those are going to speak today, but I've been influenced, I think, by the great thinkers in the history of intellectual thought, of some of them, David Hume, J.S. Mill particularly. But I suppose that's why they are still considered to be great thinkers, right? They still have an influence and impact upon our writings today. So that's where I am. Before I just finish, I just wanted to, I know Minouche is going to introduce, I'm not going to introduce anybody. I just want to say why I invited these four speakers today. Who shall I start with? I think I should start with, I'll start with Bob. Bob taught me behavioural economics as an undergraduate. He wouldn't remember this. I was very forgettable, still am, I guess, but I was extremely forgettable then, right? And, you know, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Bob basically introduced me to behavioural economics. Bob is one of the great behavioural economists. I don't think that's always recognised as much as it ought to be. And I think he's also one of the great liberal thinkers. So I do owe a lot to Bob. Shaun Hargreaves Heap, who's now at King's College, been there for many years, he also taught me as an undergraduate. He taught me macroeconomics. I remember him throwing copies of Keynes' book around the room, saying, "Is Keynes a charlatan?" That's my memory of Shaun Hargreaves. But what I've learned over the course of time, I mean, I lost contact with Shaun for obviously many, many years, decades even. But we've kind of come back together, and I realise now that Shaun's approach to behavioural public policy is the closest to mine, probably of anybody. He has a constitutional approach to behavioural public policy. It's a contractarian approach, probably closer than Shaun and I are probably closer than Bob, because Bob's a bit more libertarian than I am. As you can see from my explanation of my approach, I'm still reasonably interventionist, I think. Gus is a paternalist, but if I'm going to allow anybody to be a paternalist, I would allow it to be you, Gus, right? Without Gus, I don't think behavioural public policy would have flourished in the way it has over the last 15 years. He was instrumental in establishing the Behavioural Insights team, along with David, who's in the audience, that would help him. And without the Behavioural Insights team, you know, we wouldn't have had this massive increase in interests in behavioural public policy all around the world. I know I criticise some of the approaches that are undertaken in behavioural public policy, but I've benefited from that as well, and I've been allowed and enabled to develop my own approaches to behavioural public policy because I've sat within this explosion of interest. I've been doing behavioural economics for 30 years almost now, I think. But, it's only over the last 15 years that behavioural public policy has really, really flourished and expanded. Without Gus, I don't think that would have happened. So he's one of the global catalysts, I think, to behavioural public policy. I'm sure you've had one or two other achievements as well along the way, right, Gus? And then Liz, at the end here, Liz Costa, she's the managing director of the UK office of the Behavioural Insights team. And I think you've still got a visiting position at the LSE. So Liz, I've only relatively recently, made my acquaintance with Liz over the last year or two. But she, I think, is going to be one of the big players as we go forward in behavioural public policy as well, both from the sort of policy side, but also integrating academic concerns with, policymaker interests. So thank you very much. Oh, one last thing, just one last thing. Minouche, right? Minouche Shafik I've been at the LSE for 22 years. She's the first director that has taken a very strong or active interest in what I'm doing, right? As a field in behavioural public policy. I've tried, believe me, I've tried, right? As you can see from my constant email messages, right? But, Minouche has been absolutely fantastic in, giving the sense that this field matters, and matters within the LSE as well, that she's been a catalyst for creating behavioural public policy as a niche, I think, within the LSE. She's just been appointed to Columbia University as president of Columbia University, so she's going to be leaving the LSE, but I can say that Columbia's gain is very much LSE's loss, right? So on that sad note, I'll hand back over to Shafik. Thank you, Shafik.
Thank you, Adam, for those kind words. You stole my lines, so you basically introduced the panel. So in the interest of time and giving the panel more airtime, I'm going to just turn it over to them, and we will start with Gus O'Donnell. The only thing you didn't mention about Gus is that he was the Cabinet Secretary of Her Majesty's Government from 2005 to 2011, and Permanent Secretary of the Treasury from 2002 to 2005, knighted by the Queen, crossbench peer in the House of Lords, and most importantly, a visiting professor at the LSE and my former boss. Over to you, Gus.
Thanks. I'll probably stand up just to get this through, and I'll stick strictly to 10 minutes, which
Sorry, I probably
you did go over. As predicted. So first of all, I'd say this. I have had the pleasure of reading this, which you haven't, and I would change the title, right? A political economy of, and I just leave out behavioural, because actually a lot of what's in this is about the philosophical foundations of public policy. There's a lot about what the state should do, what it shouldn't do. You can put the word behavioural in front of a lot of things, but if you think about what a very large proportion of public policy is, it's about things which actually implicitly or explicitly change behaviour. So I kind of think, yeah, we want to market it as behavioural, but actually I would say it's broader than that, and I think people should read it to think about the philosophical foundations of what's the right size of the state. So that's my first point. Secondly, I'm probably here to be the grubby person that's like, yeah, there's a lot of philosophy, but what actually goes on in government, right? And if you think about it, a lot of policy analysis is of the form of some version of cost-benefit analysis, right? So the Treasury Green Book, for example, is a classic example of these are the kinds of things we weigh out the pros and cons, and we are implicitly using a utilitarian framework, right? So there's a lot that's utilitarian. That's kind of the way things are at the minute. It's not recognised very much, and there are lots of times when actually it doesn't work very well. For example, when you're dealing with something which has lots of implications for rights, for example, when you have to actually say this sort of thing doesn't really work. So there's a lot about that. The other part that doesn't really work about that kind of a policy analysis is it assumes that you know what success is. So it might be, maximising some kind of welfare function, or it might be in terms of income. It might, if it's kind of really advanced, be in terms of well-being years. But that's the part where it quite often falls down in terms of public policy. Ministers do not routinely know what they're trying to achieve. Right? Let's be perfectly blunt about this. Right? If you ask them about policy outcomes, it's in health. No, I want to stop the NHS falling over. I've heard that so many times during COVID. I want to stop the NHS falling over. Why? God, because it's embarrassing. It's like, actually, curious enough, don't you really care about people's health? I mean, and actually, as David Halpern there would say, actually, if we really did care about people's health, it would be radically different what we do. If you look at, and David's done some sums on this, the amount of money we spend on cure versus prevention, it's ridiculous. It's completely, there's no kind of objective function which actually gets you to the place where you're spending this mass of clearing up the mess and this tiny amount on trying to prevent the mess occurring in the first place. So I think that's a really important point. Adams explained he's a liberal, right? I kind of subtext was if the behavioural thing, if what the person's doing, their behaviour affects no one else, then the state should butt out. That's basically it. I mean, but, and there's quite a lot of buts, right? But that only applies for adults with full agency. Now, when you think about a lot of the stuff we have to do on public policy, enormous number of times people do not have full agency. A lot of the people we're dealing with don't. So there's quite a big role there within your own terms for behavioural public policy, I think, and for thinking about these things then. Secondly, respect for autonomy. I very strongly believe in respect for autonomy, but again, as you yourself say, there's a but there. There's a trade-off. You give an example in the book where actually if the welfare cost is so high and the autonomy gain so small, you actually probably don't want to, you would take the trade-off. So there are trade-offs there. Educate first is another thing that Adam's very, very strong on, rather than doing nudge. Why don't you try and teach people or get people to learn so that they get better at it themselves, which I think is absolutely fine. But I think nearly all of the behavioural issues I've come across, we tried educating and we've got as far as we think we can. We've tried telling people about smoking and, you got to a point where you're looking for what next. So I'm with it, but this question, one of the most obvious behavioural interventions, and I say the most effective, the whole question of opt-out on pensions. I think that's a classic example where, are we reducing people's autonomy by, moving it to opt-in versus opt-out? Actually, what I would say is we didn't, and I know this. When we created the policy in the first place, we didn't think about a choice architecture of the form that we did, that was there. It was just one of those things, and there's a lot of things that are like that. And actually, if we created it with the opt-out the other way, would we be interfering with people by changing it to the other way? So I kind of think we have a duty to think about these things from the start. Then we've got back to the point, Adam's point, the liberal position. How many behaviours don't affect others? You've got some lovely stuff in the book about, I've called him 5 Donut Man. I mean, there's someone who's kind of he's hitting the donuts really hard. And like, to what extent should we just let him get on with it? You know, we can educate him about, you know, the implications for his health and all the rest of it. But actually, is this just affecting him in a world where the costs of obesity are massive? All taxpayers are going to have to pay for them. You know, when you think about a lot of these things, actually trying to think of something which is just you. I mean, I completely agree. If it's only you, fine. But there aren't that many. The other example I have, which isn't in your book, which is occurred to me, I'm embarrassed to say this, a week ago with a very bad hangover, thinking that me now, would really like to regulate me, who's just finished the first bottle of wine, to say, actually, I don't want you making the decision about whether to open the second bottle of wine. So I would quite like myself to regulate me plus the bottle of wine, and I'm actually quite in favour of the state actually helping me in that process. I mean, I think David did some work with the whole smoking ban in pubs, where actually it turned out that smokers were in favour of banning smoking in pubs. They wanted, you know, this kind of, you know, bind their hands kind of thing.
Waste the taxpayers' money to try to stop you from drinking.
Who knows? Who knows? There's a big cost benefit there, isn't there? Lessons for public policymakers. I think I'll just finish off with 2 or 3 points on this. First, obviously educate more, help people learn. I think that's really one of the important things, is that we do like learning, but if the costs of failure are fatal, you know, we don't actually let children learn how to manage a fire by putting their hands in. We do stop them, you know, we behaviourally intervene. So I think that's important. And then we come to the 2 things about the behavioural biases which are inherent in decision makers who actually do policy. So let's start with ministers, right? I have never heard a minister say, don't just do something, stand there, right? That's not where they are, okay? They are presented with problems, and they therefore think about, what do I do to solve this problem? Now, when you think about what are their instincts are, ministers have been MPs. They have spent years in Parliament. What's Parliament? It's a place that does legislation. What therefore do ministers think of when you give a problem to them? Legislating, right? That's kind of where they are. Legislation, we were just talking about this in terms of online safety bill and all these sorts of things, horrible solution to most problems where the technology is moving, things are changing radically. If you get legislation, whatever that legislation turns out to be, I can guarantee you in 5 years' time, you'll wish that you'd done something different. And it's really difficult once something's in primary legislation to change it. So to me, legislate last rather than first, which I think is a big thing for behavioural public policy, because it quite often is an alternative. So that'd be my first place. In terms of civil servants, I'm accused of being a paternalist, which is almost certainly true. Civil servants go into public service, and, you know, if you go into the Treasury, you probably turn down going to an investment bank. Therefore, you are actually quite public-spirited. And being public-spirited is you actually want to make the world a better place. Now, why does this lead to paternalism and to probably doing more than a pure liberal might like? You have to look at David Halpin's badge that he's wearing, which says, I love evidence, right? And we do love evidence. And quite often there isn't any evidence. And how do you create evidence? We do a trial, or you do different things. You know, you create some evidence. Think about, you know, the whole COVID thing, the terrible policy at the start. We didn't have any evidence. And then the ONS actually gives us some proper data because they went out and collected things. So I think we do want to, we are paternalist. That is a bias, I think, in civil servants. And one thing, a final question from me would be, there is a big problem that I detect in the civil service now. It's growing all the time. And that is a problem of diversity. And it's not a problem of diversity of gender or ethnicity or anything. The problem is, if you're going to be a senior civil servant working in Westminster and you want to own a property, you need the bank of mum and dad. And the ones who haven't got that are going off to do expensive jobs somewhere else. So we are going to have a civil service that's got a lot of people who have the bank of mum and dad behind them. that is going to impose some biases. Haven't yet worked out quite what they are and what implications they are, but I think someone should work on that, and that will give you a clue to the kind of biases that are coming up through the system towards ministers. But I finished by saying Adam's done us, I mean, this is part of the trilogy. He's done the reciprocity, and I think for me, I've kind of thought, yes, how do we educate kids on reciprocity, getting the right desires? You talk about desires a lot as well. I think it's a brilliant read. I loved it. It stimulated me to think about all sorts of aspects of policy, not just the ones that are called behavioural, and I commend it to the audience. Thank you.
Well, I can assure you, no book throwing, not planned.
Throw my book.
Yes, that's true. I should say one of the really difficult things about something like this is deciding what you're going to say. There are loads of things you could say, but you don't know what other people are going to say. And so you somehow have to anticipate what they're going to say and say something different. So what I thought I would talk about on this occasion was the very explicit and self-conscious way that Adam positions himself in these debates over behavioural public policy as a liberal. And in some sense, I think it's a very brave position to take up, that it's quite so explicit throughout the book that he is carrying the flag of liberalism. I say I think it's quite brave because in some sense, liberalism right now is an embattled political philosophy. There are those who oppose it within our own politics on populist or polarising grounds. Globally, there are varieties of authoritarian governments that oppose liberalism, quite literally in the case of Putin's Russia. And then, unusually right now, when liberals might be able to rely on the friendship of other parts of the political spectrum that oppose populism, on this particular occasion, they can't rely upon them because there are many of those other parts of the political spectrum that quietly blame liberalism in the form of neoliberalism for the mess that our politics are in. So none of the usual allies to call upon and plenty of hostile elements. So announcing your liberal credentials isn't on the face of things going to win you many converts to whatever the specific arguments are that you're going to be making about behavioural public policy. Nevertheless, I want to applaud Adam's liberal positioning, and in order to explain how I understand Adam's liberal positioning and why I applaud it, I want to take you back to a much earlier crisis in liberalism, crisis in the 1930s, and in particular to a book that was written in 1937 by Walter Lippmann. Now, if you're anything like me, until I read Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society, that he wrote in, until I read it about 18 months ago, Walter Lippmann was one of those names that rings a familiar bell that you sort of ought to know about, but you can't remember why on earth you know about them. And so let me just quickly jog your memories about who Walter Lippmann is. Walter Lippmann was a journalist, political commentator, very influential in the 20th century, wrote varieties of books, not just The Good Society, won several Pulitzer Prizes, and crucially, could whisper in the ear of most of that century's US presidents. Started with Woodrow Wilson. He wrote a very famous memo for Woodrow Wilson about getting involved in World War I, accompanied Woodrow Wilson to the Versailles Peace Treaty. And his influence over US presidents, the ability to sort of, so to speak, go and talk to the White House, went right up to Lyndon Johnson, who he had a very public spat with over the Vietnam War. So I'll say a little bit more about Lippmann later on if I've got time. Now, the reason I mention his book is that Lippmann argues that liberalism in the 1930s had become embattled because it had inappropriately embraced and defended a static and fossilized 19th century version of a concept of liberty. That was the laissez-faire version of liberalism that makes markets and private property rights the clarion call of liberalism, and which, as a result, expends a lot of its political energy trying to hold or shrink the activities of the state. Indeed, to give this a bit of a contemporary resonance, that's the kind of laissez-faire kind of liberalism that diagnoses that the UK's current problems emanate from, and I'm quoting here, a bloated state, high taxes and excessive regulation. And I'm quoting, of course, from Britannia Unchained. Or I might have mentioned for another contemporary resonance of that laissez-faire liberalism in today's political debates, those who argue that Brexit offers a great opportunity to have a wonderful, I quote again, bonfire of regulations. Not so, said Lippmann. Liberalism is a dynamic political philosophy born of engaging with the dynamic society that spawned it. And its message is that we need to constantly adjust the rules and regulations that give us rights to liberty so that they are fit in the changing circumstances of the time to give us the liberty that allows us to become individuals. The task of liberals is not to resist regulations and have bonfires of regulations. Regulations, for Lippmann, enable and they constrain. And the task of liberals is to adjust the regulations to the inevitably new and changing conditions of the time so that they constrain those who would otherwise harm others in these new circumstances. And in this way, the adjustments enable those others to enjoy the liberty from which they as individuals can flourish. Now, what Lippmann said is, look, that is a much more difficult and painstaking task than the work that the fossilized laissez-faire version of liberalism announces when it suggests a bonfire of the regulations or a rolling back of the state. And for Lippmann, such a program was at best a lazy form of liberalism, a misunderstanding of liberalism, or perhaps worse, less charitably, something much worse. Now, the point of me having this excursion into Lippmann is to position Adams' liberalism as the kind of liberalism that Lippmann might applaud. And I say this because in his new book, Adam has, as he suggested, these two policy arms or two broad sets of policy proposals. And they are, I think, exactly the kind of engagement with a changing world that Lippmann would have applauded so as to secure liberty in such a changing world, the kind of liberty from which individuals flourish. First is the proposal that Adam mentioned to boost the reciprocating impulse in human behaviour. And I take what Adam says here to be in the spirit of what liberals would refer to as a reimagining of the positive rights that people need. The other arm that Adam mentions is Adam's budge agenda. And I take this to be a good example of how our negative rights have to be reimagined in a changing world, not least because one of the ways in which it has changed is that people have become familiar with behavioural insights, and those behavioural insights may well be used by some to harm others. Now, actually, I have to say, in my own work, I would press using Mill's harm principle that Adam referred to. I'd add a third direction, that I think we need to reimagine our rights in the form of rights to social insurance. But that's another matter. The point is, and it's the point that I want to leave you with, is that Adam is sceptical, I think, about the proliferation of nudges that we've seen in the behavioural public policy agenda, but not on those laissez-faire liberal grounds that resists any extension of government intervention. Instead, I think his scepticism comes from asking questions about whether those interventions are a response to a changing world in ways that are going to re-establish the kind of liberty in which individuals flourish. And I'm with him on that, both on the questioning and being sceptical about the answers that you might get when you inspect the particular forms of nudging interventions that take place. I promised you I'd say another word about Walter Lippmann. Finish off with that, why you should take what he has to say seriously. If you're a liberal of any stripe, Lippmann's book has two really important resonances for liberals in the post-war period. And they're very, very different resonances that ought to sort of shake you up about what he's saying here about liberalism. The first is that he sets out the kinds of changes in positive and negative rights that he thinks are going to be necessary for the revival of liberalism from its dormant state in the 1930s. Those programs that he sets out for reimagining what positive and negative rights are going to be like anticipate many of the very important changes that took place in the post-war period associated with the revival of liberalism in rich countries in the OECD area. So in that sense, he anticipates precisely what we associated with that revival. Second, very different resonance is French philosopher picked up on The Good Society, year after it was published, held a colloquium in Paris around the book, at which Hayek attended. That colloquium, in retrospect, in the genealogy of post-war liberalism, was the forerunner of the Mont Pelerin Society. Walter Lippmann, though, never went to a Mont Pelerin Society meeting. I commend you, Walter Lippmann, and I think he would applaud Adam.
Again, I'm just going to hover above the PowerPoint thing at the bottom.
Okay. Well, obviously, sorry, oops, sorry about this.
That's right. So you closed it, Bob.
Sorry? I did close it, but how do I reopen it?
I think that's probably to go to PowerPoint.
Oh, I did. Oh, sorry, no, no. And then go on. And this is,
Oh.
no?
It's fine with the notes. It's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
I don't know.
You got the swap for you.
Okay, well, I wanted to just make some comments on Adam's book, which I really enjoyed. Adam's aim is to further his preferred overarching political economy of behavioural public policy. And as everyone said so far, the distinctive feature of the approach that Adam is taking is it's liberal, and it's liberal in the tradition of John Stuart Mill. And here, certainly, I wouldn't regard myself as a libertarian, but certainly Adam and I are definitely allies in supporting a liberal approach to public policy in the tradition of John Stuart Mill. Now, in a sense, rehearsing what Adam said, but there are two key features of Mill's approach which Adam is wanting to endorse. The first of them is what Mill would call the protected sphere, the idea that each person should have a protected sphere of individual action. And here's a quote from Adam. He says, "If you allow people to be free, most of the mental apparatus to seek and find practices of mutual benefit without the hands-on involvement of third parties who claim to know better." So the underlying idea behind this, as I read it, a liberal society is structured by voluntary interaction for mutual benefit. Economic agency is seeking mutual benefit between yourself and others. That seems to be the theme of what Adam is saying. That's his reciprocity. That would be my philosophy too. And so public policy should support individuals in developing these skills, not try to substitute them. And in this way, this is a part of Adam's line which is, you might say, less interventionist than nudging. The second key feature is the harm principle, or I would say in a sense the complement of the harm principle. Mill's harm principle, the only purpose which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilised community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And Adam's complement, which I'm sure Mill would have agreed with, is power can be rightfully exercised over one person to prevent harm to others. And in particular, public policy should use budgets. This is Adam's line. And budgets are regulations against, this is a quote from Adam, against negative externalities of behaviourally informed manipulations of consumers by firms. So this is clearly more interventionist than nudging because it's got a regulatory component. So it seems to me that what Adam has got here is he's got a descriptive concept of behavioural influence. The term behavioural influences or manipulations comes up lots and lots of times in the book. And the thought is that the concept of behavioural influence, which Adam is taking to be grounded in behavioural science, this is why it's a what's making the behavioural book. And in effect, at least I read it, a behavioural influence is really a nudge, defined objectively, defined without reference to any sort of normative content. It's the behavioural science of a nudge. Oh, yes, sorry. And so the protected sphere in Adam's proposal is to say government should not nudge for good. Remember, if you know Thaler, if you ever, well, not have been in this position, but if you bought one of Thaler's books and took it to him and said, "Please sign this, Richard," he will put on nudge for good. And Adam's line is, I think, don't nudge for good. That's not the job of government to be nudging for good. The harm principle is firms shouldn't be nudging for bad, and it's the government's job to stop them. Now, what I want to say, Adam will have heard this many times before, and some of you will too, but this presupposes that you can make a meaningful distinction between, that you've got to have a concept of behavioural influence, and then there must be a distinction between what behaviour in the presence of these influences and behaviour in the absence of them. And that would, because if you didn't have that concept, you wouldn't be able to nudge for good, or you wouldn't know what nudging for good is or what nudging for bad is. And with Gerardo Infante and Guillaume Lecoultre, I've argued, and I still think this is right, that this is not a psychologically grounded distinction. It's not a conclusion of behavioural science. The concept of behavioural influence and bias is not a legitimate scientific concept. Why not? Well, because the effects that behavioural science has found, loss aversion, present bias, certainty effects, they're not errors, they're not biases. What they are patterns in behaviour. They're context dependent, saying that in certain contexts people do X, in certain contexts they do Y. And the context is there's a behavioural context, and that's why I'm not taking the line that Adam is of saying that that's behavioural effects work for good. I'm not saying anything about good or bad. I'm just saying that there isn't there's the idea that there's a baseline of behaviour that's not influenced, and that they can then determine either a nudging for good or a nudging for bad, I think doesn't exist. That what we see are arbitrary, apparently arbitrary, I would say, but really are arbitrary. The variations in the context of framing of decision problem induce different choices. And those differences don't plausibly reflect differences in effects on welfare, but there's no concept of the correct choice. Behavioural science doesn't need one, doesn't have one. So there's no concept of correct and incorrect. And now, one escape route from this, which I think actually a lot of behavioural economists do, but in a not owning up to, is to define some objective standard of welfare. So if you had an objective standard, say, well, in some sense, Gus was a bit suggesting this with smoking. If you said, well, our objective is to increase life expectancy, our objective is to prevent people turning to hospital with lung cancer. If you had an objective standard of welfare, then you could define correctness of preference, not as it would be the correct preference of those which would lead you to do what's been defined to be welfare. Now, I think a lot of behavioural economists are closeted objectivists. They do think this, but this isn't a route for the million liberal. So it's not a route that I can take, it's not a route that Adam can take. Now, I think Adam needs, so my diagnosis is that Adam needs a baseline from which to identify the behavioural influence. If you say, it says regulate the bad firms are using behavioural influences to manipulate people's choices. But unless we know what counts as a correct choice or a good choice, we won't know what the bad manipulation is. So, and now the concept which Adam uses, which keeps appearing, I thought, obviously I like this one. He has a concept of free and fair exchange, and that keeps appearing in the book, although it's not, I didn't think it was defined. And the budgets, what the budgets are supposed to do are the directed behavioural influences which obstruct free and fair exchange. So we need to have I need a concept of a free and fair exchange that we can then enable us to define what budge policies are required. Now, what makes an exchange free and fair? Well, here are some possible answers. The first one's a one which I think Adam can't take. One would be to say, well, a free and fair exchange is... Adam has a chapter called Desert, which I must admit I was very unpersuaded by. But you could say, well, a trading environment is one in which everyone's rewarded according to their deserts. That's what counts as fair. Well, I strongly endorse Hayek in this. Hayek says voluntary interactions can't be structured by desert. Basically, it's a very simple reason. Each person's, if you've got a system of voluntary interaction between people, how much each person, how much I benefit depends on what other people want. And so other people, looking at it from my point of view, I say, other people's arbitrary changes, other people's change in tastes, desires, whatever, have effects on me. And there's no way you can kind of cancel those out in a system of voluntary exchange. So basically, you just have to accept that a free and fair market is not going to give people their desert. So I think that's a non-starter. I don't think Adam is doing that, but I didn't really follow the desert chapter. Another possible thought, which I've already told you why you can't have it, you could say, well, a trading environment with no psychological cues at all. So if there were no psychological, if you said behavioural influences equal psychological cues, you could say, oh, well, let's design a market where there are no psychological cues. I think a traditional pure theory in economics might have thought that was possible, because you just say, well, we already know what commodities are, we already know people have already got preferences, we just give them a list of things to choose from. But I mean, that's a non-starter. It's certainly not got any psychological basis. Any behavioural theory of choice, any psychological theory of choice, has to have psychological cues, because we're human beings. That's what we respond to. So that's doesn't work. You might say, well, a trading environment in which no one faces psychological cues that are activated by other trading parties in the pursuit of their own interests. So you're not allowed to. This actually, I think, to some extent, Thaler does hint at that when he talks about sludge. He sort of says something like, "Oh, you ought to nudge for good. You shouldn't be nudging for profit. Firms shouldn't be nudging for profit. They should be thinking about the welfare of their consumers." And I think, well, that's also not going to work. Because this doesn't fit with the concept of the protected sphere and the million thought. A free society is a space in which agents seek mutual benefit. And each agent is judging what's good for him or her. So seeking mutual benefit means making offers, seeking mutual benefit to other people means making offers to other people for cooperative action, cooperative strategy, cooperative schemes, which are good for you. And you hope they're good. I think I have this thought, I could do a deal with Adam. It seems to me, I know it's good for me, and I think it's going to be good for, I might think it's good for Adam, but actually it's Adam's job to decide that it's good for him. And because, again, this whole million thought that it's not the good, it's not each person, it's not the government's, if it's not the government's job to decide what's good for other people, in a certain sense it's not the job of anybody to decide what's good for other people. And so I think that the whole idea that somehow we need a concept of free and fair exchange which doesn't take this. Yeah. And so I think that what it comes down to is that we need a concept. We need a liberal theory of markets with a concept of free and fair exchange. It's got to be compatible with what we know about human psychology. So it shouldn't be assuming neoclassical rational agents, but it also shouldn't invoke psychologically ungrounded concepts of true preferences, bias, behavioural influence, and so on. And, well, with apologies, this is what I've been working on with my colleague Bruce Lyons, trying to produce a concept. But, it's a difficult job, but I think what, as a liberal, I have to do is to try to find a concept of transactional fairness, which can stand for fair exchange between people who are seeking mutual benefit without prejudging one another's tastes. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Minouche, how are we going for time overall?
We're supposed to be done, so
You're
you
supposed to
Yeah, but
Well, I'm
you'll take your, you get your just desserts.
let's see. Does anybody know how to do it without
There,
notes?
yeah, come to the top and you swap.
This one?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Adam, firstly, I want to thank you and congratulate you for writing this book. I really did enjoy it and I found it deeply thought-provoking. And I also think it's provided, as Gus said, a really excellent philosophical foundation for us to debate and deliberate on the future of behavioural public policy. And before we started tonight, I said to Adam that I loved the book, I admired a lot about it, I agreed with a lot of what he said, but that I ultimately came to a different position myself. And Adam said, well, of course you did, Liz. I'm a liberal and you're a paternalist. And I think actually it's not quite so black and white as that, and hopefully I'll convince you of that, Adam, over the next few minutes. But if I am to declare my position up front, I think it is that I am open to and supportive of a greater level of intervention than perhaps Adam is. But a very particular type of intervention. And what I want to talk about tonight is how we can move behavioural public policy towards more systemic and what I'd like to call upstream interventions, which are really trying to shape markets, shape the incentives of players within markets, and shape the environment in which people are making choices. And throughout the book, at the end of every chapter, Adam puts some great questions and food for thought. And like Gus, I was quite captivated by the 5 donut a day man that Adam talks about. And one of the provocations that he makes is whether government manipulation to reduce that person's consumption of donuts is legitimate. And perhaps it's clear in the framing of that question that Adam's conclusion is that no, it is not. And particularly because he feels that regulating to limit the number of donuts that somebody is eating on a daily basis is really too much of an intrusion into that person's personal lifestyle choices from a liberal perspective. And I think actually, Adam, for the reasons that you articulate, I do agree that this is probably not a fruitful avenue for government intervention, both from a liberal perspective, but both from a perspective of efficacy. I don't think that we would get particularly far if we were trying to mandate people's individual donut consumption. But I do think that there is a legitimate role for the state and for behavioural public policy in this donut eating person's life. And I'd like to talk through what that is. So firstly, I'm going to set out very briefly this model of upstream, midstream and downstream behavioural public policy. And really, if we think about any system or environment in which we're observing people's behaviour, we have these types of downstream interventions where you have a choice environment and you're asking somebody to either do something or stop doing something, but it's going against the grain of that person's choice environment. So really what we're doing is we're sitting in this downstream part of the river and we're telling people to swim harder, to eat fewer donuts, even though they're cheap and they're tasty and they're readily available. And I think this is really not a particularly fruitful place for us to focus our efforts as a field. However, I think it is possible for us to move further upstream. And really where we get into that midstream, we've got here a back eddy where we're trying to protect people from the flow. We're trying to create an environment in which choices are easy, socially normative, and where you're really trying to harness and go with the grain of people's behaviour. So interventions like defaults would fit into this midstream. But then, when we look at the body of particularly experimental work, but behavioural public policy to date, I think most of it does sit in that downstream to midstream part of this metaphorical river. And where I think the real gains are for us to go is to go upstream and try and redirect the flow and to shape markets and align incentives and choice environments to make the types of behaviour we're trying to encourage just as easy as possible so that people are literally going with the flow of that river. And I want to go through very quickly just a couple of examples of what that might look like in practice. And I think, Adam, some of these are quite consistent with the ideas you put forward on reputational competition in particular, but also the free and fair exchange that Bob was talking about as well. So if we return to our donut eater, if we're looking at the incentives of that market and the way that they're making the choices about what they want to eat, what I've got here is the example of the UK sugar levy, where by introducing a tax on sugary drinks that had a very particular design. You can see here, I don't think I've got a clicker, but you can see those two thresholds. And so instead of being a linear tax, there were these 2 points, and you can see what's happening here is that soft drink producers were reformulating their products to reduce the amount of sugar in those products to come in underneath those tax thresholds. And we see here that there's a 44% reduction in the sugar content of those drinks, even as sales are rising. So what I contend is this upstream approach is not only effective, but it also does preserve this donut eater's autonomy and liberty. They're still able to eat 5 donuts. They could even eat 6 if they want to compensate for the reduced amount of sugar if we were doing this for donuts. But I think it's very unlikely that they would. And actually, in doing so, we've we've furthered our collective goals in terms of public health. I think we've just published a report on how this could apply in the case of net zero. So the research shows that around 9 in 10 people in the UK would like to make more sustainable choices, but they find it very difficult to do so. And one of the reasons that they find it so difficult is that it's very hard to discern actually what a green choice is. If you're in a restaurant, if you're picking your pension or your bank, it's really difficult to work out actually what choices would be consistent with a net zero society and with reducing your own carbon footprint. And we think here that there's real potential to have much clearer market signals and unleash consumer preferences to favour green businesses. And what you can see here is some really nascent examples, but they are each problematic in their own way. The menu is actually one that restaurant David was at the other night. But if any of you can work out what is actually the greenest and most sustainable choice on this menu, I would applaud you. If you can also work out why the affogato and the ice cream are so different when they are effectively the same thing, I would also applaud you. But these things really matter. It really matters if we want people to be making choices that are consistent with net zero and consistent with their own preferences and desires. And we really haven't cracked this yet. And I think this is a big frontier for the field going forward. And finally, I want to touch on what this means for economic growth. And David and I are working on this at the moment and hoping to write a book on the topic. But we think that really there are potentially, it's hugely consequential in the way that our economy functions and in the way that capital is allocated within our economy and our ability to drive productivity growth. We use these types of feedback and reputational measures in lots of aspects of consumer markets. So if you were to go to dinner after this session, you can get a pretty good sense from Yelp and Google reviews what a good restaurant around here might be. It's not perfect. You get some reputation inflation, you get faked reviews, but you can make a pretty good choice based on those transparency mechanisms. And what they're really doing is de-shrouding key attributes of price, of quality, and it's good for businesses as well. So if you're a small independent restaurant on the Strand or on Aldwych, you really want people to be seeing that kind of feedback. It disproportionately favours those businesses who don't otherwise have that brand and reputation recognition. And a lot of Mike Luca's work really focuses on this, and he shows that just an extra star on a 5-star rating boosts that restaurant's sales by 7% in the following year. So it's really consequential for consumers, but also for businesses. And there's whole swathes of the economy where those types of mechanisms either don't function very well or just don't exist at all, and particularly in B2B markets. So it's really very difficult to work out who's a good lawyer, who's a good accountant, who's a good growth advisor. And the instinct is for government to leave this for the market to solve, but demonstrably that's not happening. And there's also lots of cases where the government is building the market itself. And here you've got an example of that, where you're directing people to subsidised help to grow management courses. But you can't really tell from this government platform, actually, are they any good? Are they going to help your business to improve its management? You have no idea. You just know if it's close to you, which is arguably just not a very good metric. So really we think that addressing this issue at scale and testing and scaling these types of de-shrouding techniques could really lift the UK's productivity and trend growth rate. So just to wrap up and return to the question of is it legitimate to reduce a person's consumption of donuts? I would say if you're intervening directly in that person's life, probably not. We don't want to say you can only eat 3 rather than 5 donuts. But if we are shaping the food environment in which they're making those choices, reducing the amount of sugar and fat in foods generally, making it less likely that they're going to eat 5 donuts a day, then I think that's not only legitimate but highly desirable. And I think without these types of midstream and upstream interventions, we risk boxing behavioural public policy into quite a narrow field. And I really hope that over the next decade we can explore these types of mechanisms for the collective good, but also in a way that preserves individual freedoms as well. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Liz. We have about 20 minutes for comments and questions, and I'm going to take 3 from the audience. You can direct it to an individual or to Adam as well as the panel, or you can leave it in the air and whoever would like to answer it can do so. Who would like to start? And please introduce yourselves when you start. Start here, and David.
I'm going down from LSE. It was this issue that you set out about this not just being behavioural economics, but economics of public policy. And this fascinating point you were making about liberalism and neoliberalism. And there are all these books coming out now, The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism. I just wondered to what extent did Adam's book help us move in a different direction, because we clearly do need a new philosophical background for moving forward.
Okay, thank you. David. Get the microphone.
I don't think the mic's working actually.
All right, sorry.
So shout, okay.
Shout.
Great set of presentations, and thank you. I'm looking forward to looking at. I was trying to reflect what our origins of the paper insight team was, and even going back to the 2003 thing we did with Tony Blair, we relied very heavily on the argument around behavioural predators, partly because there was fear about the state was already too heavy-handed. And then, of course, the coalition agreement was very much, I think, one you'd probably be comfortable with, which is supporting people to make better choices for themselves. That was the wording which sat behind it. That said, one, I think, reason why it's useful to have this continual debate and challenge, which is there's actually an asymmetry, Gus sort of was alluding to it in his remarks, in what we get actually asked to do quite often. And arguably it's changing over time, particularly for us and some other teams doing work, which is has become more and more a commission model, which is that some of the stuff which I think you'd approve of, like, I mean, the big arguments we had on e-cigarettes, make e-cigarettes available as an additional choice, looks pretty damn liberal. We thought on the basis of some decent evidence, not everyone agrees, but a lot of lies there. Or some of the stuff which Liz has talked about. Actually, our issue is we are often driven towards, the decision has already substantially been made on the policy. Can you basically make these damn citizens do this thing we sort of want them to do? As opposed to some of the upstream stuff, which is much more radical often, which is harder to get to. And Richard Thaler has referred to this as so-called permission bias. And it's quite a major issue, actually. So I think, actually I found the discussion very helpful because it helped to clarify that's one of the things that's happening, is that we ourselves are operating in an environment where certain kinds of policy options tend to get differentially shut down more than others. And so it's worth us redoubling our efforts, at least from those who probably thought of ourselves as broadly being liberal and where we started from, to make sure is that what's actually playing out in the institutional interactions which we're logged into.
I can take one more before. Anyone else? All right, let's start with those. Anyone want to react to an alternative to the neoliberal paradigm? And
Adam, do you want to come up as well?
Can you?
Yeah, Adam.
I'm more interested in. I hear myself every day. So.
Yeah, but it's your book, so you can. I think in particular to David.
Yes, my short answer would be yes. I think that Adam's book is very helpful because he casts liberalism in a different way and suggests, as it were, to my mind at least, it's much more in the revolutionary and radical sense of liberalism that Walter Lippmann was wanting to reanimate in the post-war period. And I think the two directions that Adam sends us in are very much more helpful in that respect and mark contrast to the neoliberalism. Yeah.
Adam, did you want to add anything particularly to?
Can I just have one question? I mean, this you could comment on this as well, Minouche, actually, because it seems to me that there's not there's no political parties that are genuinely classical liberal, right? So that you got this sort of left-wing parties, if you like, a little bit less so, but they are heavily, seems to me, heavily paternalistic in their directions, you know, heavily state intervention. You've got the right-wing parties that are, well, been interventionists during the pandemic, but generally quite laissez-faire, actually. The opposite, the different sort of liberalism, if you like, that I prefer. And you'd think that there'd be a space somewhere in between those extremes where the Liberal Party might kick in. But I don't see the Liberal Party as being embracing classical liberalism, you know, being concerned about allowing people to be free, but recognising that in order to secure freedom for everybody in general, there needs to be some constraints put on some individual freedoms, right? This was a Bertrand argument, I think, wasn't it? Is there ever going to be a hope for a political party like that, ever? Or, I mean, because I don't operate in a political world, whereas you have, I think, Minouche, and you definitely have.
I mean,
would people vote for me, is what I'm saying.
Always surprised me is that in the kind of nudge programme of paternalism, although it seems as though it does seem to command support, certainly amongst the sort of chattering classes, but it seems to command, but at the same time, it seems as though if you think of all the trends in society, and in terms of the tradition of deference, your deference to your school teachers, deference to your university lecturers, deference to politicians, deference to doctors, deference to ministers of religion. So all the institutions that traditionally were paternalistic seem to have lost freedom. So it always seems to me extremely strange that given this kind of current attitude of lack of and wanting to people, I have people thinking, oh, I went to see the doctor. The doctor told me that I needed these pills, but I've got a quick look on Google and I think I need something different. So it doesn't seem as though paternalism doesn't feel to be in line with the spirit of the times, and so it seems like there ought to be a niche for your party. Although I don't.
I mean, one response to your question, Adam, if I think about it, is if you think about COVID, and that threw up this debate so clearly how different governments reacted to it, right? And we had some governments who were very laissez-faire, didn't want to mandate masks, didn't want to mandate restrictions on mobility, etc. And other governments, China being an extreme one, where, highly restrictive, very paternalistic. And the one that I think might fall into your category of liberal was Sweden. Do you remember how Sweden either mandated masks, but they also didn't, they also weren't highly paternalistic. They let society self-regulate, and people self-restricted, so people themselves who were vulnerable chose not to go out, chose to work. And it was a sort of liberal approach to dealing with COVID, highly criticized, if everyone remembers in the beginning, actually turned out to have outcomes not very different than others who were more paternalistic. So I think whatever government was in power in Sweden at the beginning of the COVID crisis would, I believe, fit your liberal criterion. Gus, did you have?
Well, I would say, if you think about the kind of long sweep of, where are governments going and how interventionist are they, I think the answer is, it's pretty clear. They're becoming more interventionist and governments are doing more. Now that might reflect the fact that we vote for parties that do more, but it's, in general, I've always used this example during COVID. I can't imagine going in to see any of the prime ministers I work for and saying, Prime Minister, we need to close the pubs on Sunday. They would have just said, you're completely mad, right? There's absolutely no way people would do that. And if you went into them and said, Prime Minister, we're going to close the pubs all the time, and the theatres, and the cinemas, it's like, I can't imagine it. And there is a bit of a ratchet in all of this. Once governments have really intervened in our lives so dramatically, which they have, then it looks like, well, actually, if you can close everything down, you can do this, you can do that. These kind of interventions, I think, are more acceptable now And if you look at the kind of, just use metrics like size of state relative to GDP, they're growing pretty much everywhere. And if you look at those societies which I think, I would regard as probably some of the more successful ones, measured in terms of life satisfaction of the people living in them, the Scandis, they're the high tax, high spend kind of variant. So I think that's the way it's going. I can't resist that David, while I've got the floor, talking about e-cigarettes, right? I remember this uppity civil servant coming into my office, the Cabinet Secretary's office, smoking a cigarette, right? It's like, what is he up to? And it was the early days of e-cigarettes when they thought that the behavioural answer to stop to getting people to take up an e-cigarette rather than a cigarette was to make the e-cigarette look exactly like an ordinary cigarette. So I thought he was smoking. It was very, but it's like, and it's very interesting how things adapt. And the market then adapted and said, actually, people want something different. And so, vaping things don't look anything like cigarettes. And it's kind of like, I think that's one of the reasons why this whole thing is very dynamic. And you have to be very careful about thinking about solutions that work, because you can talk about certain things happening, and then the markets change, people's preferences change, and the world is, I think, very dynamic. So you need to be, I think one of the things I'd say about nudges and all this is you need to be quite careful about them, because things can change quite radically that you didn't really expect. And you're adapting people's behaviour, and that means they change the way they react to the nudges.
Yeah. Take this gentleman here. Any others? And Elisabeth.
Yeah, I'm Dave from the LSE, and I remember Adam talking about nudges and budgets an awful long time ago, so he's been working this for rather long.
I'm glad somebody noticed.
I did notice. The question I want to ask is, some of the grey areas around this are about products that actually are harmful but create enjoyment. And one example of this is about gambling. And the various initiatives or the possible moves towards budgets or nudges around how we deal with gambling. And Gus, the point you just made about things change over time, I mean, you can see that now with online gambling, because maybe things have to be different because of the nature of online gambling. But I wondered about how to deal with those kinds of products, which are essentially harmful in a sense, but there's enjoyment from the product in moderation, and also in the case of gambling, it supports a rather large industry as well. So how do you deal with those kinds of products which are murky?
Lucinda, do you want to?
I'm Lucinda Platt from the LSE. So I just wanted to get back a little bit to the behavioural. I know there was a suggestion that we take the behavioural out, but I wanted to get the behavioural back in, because in the discussion of regulation, I'm struggling a bit to understand when regulation is behavioural and when it's just regulation. So I wondered if those who've spoken a bit about the role of regulation, and that this is the way, that I can understand when a nudge is behavioural. I'm finding it harder to understand when a budge is behavioural regulation, when it's just regulation.
Peter John from King's College, London. I think one of the characteristics of classical liberalism is that it sort of sets up kind of clear boundaries of things that the state can do and can't do. It's what Ronald Dworkin used to call kind of trump cards, that the citizen could have this sort of clear signal that certain things are just not on. If you arrest somebody, then somebody has to know, habeas corpus, these kind of classical rights. But it strikes me when you move to the kind of behavioural policy, and actually my actual, even all the speakers here could be, it's quite slightly unclear exactly where the actual boundary are. There certain things the state actually can't do? Because it strikes me you could probably come up with some kind of justification in terms of capability, individual welfare, to actually get almost any policy kind of off the ground. So I feel that it just isn't actually that clear boundary. That actually might be a kind of good thing, that in a sense that it's up to policymakers to kind of come up with good, effective policies. But what I don't see is that kind of, it doesn't actually give you a kind of route map if you are a policymaker, to say, well, look, this we can do, this we can't, or maybe I've misunderstood what everyone's been saying, which is entirely possible.
Who would like to respond to this?
I can start on the gambling point. I'm not sure if I can capture all three questions in one answer. So I think one of the most promising types of intervention for gambling and those types of behaviours that are potentially harmful but also potentially enjoyable are forms of self-exclusion. And so a lot of the retail banks, I think, have had success in giving people mechanisms to block gambling sites from their cards, and people can opt into those, and then there's a level of positive friction when they're trying to opt out. I do think, though, the behaviour of a lot of the gambling operators is hugely predatory, and they use behavioural factors against people. And so I do think there's a really strong case for intervention there. And just to give one example, one of the responsible gambling tools which operators voluntarily took up was encouraging people to set daily deposit limits for their gambling, for their play. And we looked at a trial where a lot of those operators had drop-down menus for that daily deposit limit, which had a top anchor of £100,000 for a daily deposit limit. I mean, 3 times the national household annual income. It's absolutely bonkers. And we did a series of studies showing that actually removing that anchor dramatically reduces how much people willingly put in as their daily deposit limit. So I do think there needs to be recognition that predatory behaviour is there, and it needs a stronger hand, I think.
To pick up on where does the regulation start and the behavioural interventions finish, or vice versa, the way that I see it is slightly idiosyncratic, but it does have a sort of slightly different take on that question, which is that, to my mind, the behavioural evidence that is used in the nightly agenda points quite often in a completely different direction, which is to say that it points in the direction of us being actually humble about what we know about what makes people tick. That they often don't have well-formed preferences, and that when we intervene with nudging, we're just actually, as it were, nudging so as to create the preferences as much as actually rediscover what they originally were. And I think it's that interpretation of the behavioural evidence that we ought to be rather humble about what we know about what makes people tick. That leads you to focus, if you're a behaviourally inclined person like myself, to say that actually what we need to do is focus much more on what are the initial conditions that everybody starts at, so that they can reasonably, as it were, come to a conclusion themselves about what preferences to have. And I think it's in that context that you do indeed need to have regulations, so that, as it were, there is a reasonable expectation that people, if they have initial capabilities that are at a sufficient level, blah, 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 and sufficient freedoms to come to their own conclusions.
Julian.
It's difficult to address some of your arguments out without having read the book, but one of the arguments is, as I understand it, as Bob summarised it, is that it's legitimate for governments to avoid harm can intervene to avoid harm. But it's not legitimate for governments to intervene to promote good. That seems to be an asymmetry. Avoiding harm is promoting good. What is the difference there between the two?
No, sorry, I was going to say, I don't think that's not quite what you're saying. It's the difference between, well, I do think it isn't going to work, this asymmetry, but the thought was that if you've got a concept of, if you do have a concept of behavioural influence, so you know what it means to have a behaviour and you sort of switching on, then the thought was it's not okay for the government to switch on behavioural influences in a situation that's purely private. So you're not supposed to, if a person's making a decision which affects only themselves, it's not a problem for the government to use these behavioural powers to steer people towards what the government thinks is good. But content. And it's okay. It's what is okay is preventing other agents from nudging the bad. So I think that.
It's an externality argument. So how I would phrase it is that what Bob's trying to get at is that I don't think it's okay generally for governments to act paternalistically, to try to say, you, Julian, I'm going to try to change your behaviour because this new behaviour is in your own good, is in your own interest, yourself. So that's what I think Bob is talking about when he's saying promoting the good. But I do think that it's okay, it's potentially okay, going back to Lucinda's point. I'll have to talk about this more, Lucinda, obviously, but I think Liz answered you a little bit. It's potentially okay if a particular interest is using what are the behavioural influences, loss aversion, present bias, the dozens and dozens of heuristics that exist now, seemingly, uses those to try to manipulate other people to do things that are in that first party self-interest. So it's an externality argument there. It's to try to present the harm in an externality argument. You've written about this yourself in your book on paternalism.
Yes, indeed. I'm supporting the relation of government intervention to do good in a kind of objectivist sense. I mean, I think you're quite right, especially Bob, that most behavioural economists, and I include myself, are essentially objectivists. So, and the objective is usually, I think, coming back to a point that Gus made, utilitarian. It's basically maximising the well-being of the greatest number over the greatest length of time. That's right.
Well, what I find puzzling is the thought that if you go into being really about, you say, well, people make all these decisions in their private lives. As a government, we shouldn't be taking a position and trying to steer people in particular directions. And then you then find a firm which is it's okay. The firm is catering to the firm is putting its offers on the market. People are responding to that as human beings in the same way that they are in their private lives. So what's the difference between saying that the government shouldn't be taking a view about what's good for people when they're taking the decision themselves, but when it's their relationship with another economic agent firm, then the government then does start using their interests. So I think you're not nil actually also. You're definitely a million.
There's a risk that your argument is it's not okay for the private sector to manipulate consumers against their own interests, but it's also not okay for governments to manipulate citizens for what it perceives as their interests.
I think in response to the gambling question, you get the answer to that, which is actually gambling, smoking, alcohol, they're addictive, right? And therefore, there's very strong reasons to actually go in there, and this is where, I'm going to really upset all the liberals, change their preferences. Because actually they're not sustainable preferences for them. And so I think there is a case for that. And in fact we do. If you take gambling, we regulate gambling quite significantly already. You remember the whole question of the slot machines in betting shops, where there was a whole thing about what should the top number prize be. So we regulate there. I face this, I'm on the board of Wimbledon, the All England club, and you'll notice that if you see sports events virtually anywhere else, you'll see gambling ads in the middle of them because they're incredibly lucrative. And at Wimbledon, you will never see any gambling ads because Wimbledon basically regards reputation as being very, very important and is not interested in maximising money. We don't have to. I think that there are kind of situations where government can rightly step in to try and change preferences.
I think Adam's defence of that would be, if I may say so, that of course that addicts don't have full agency.
Exactly. And that to me would be actually a lot of people in society don't have full agency. You think about domestic abuse, you think about, there's 101 things where actually government is intervening, and it is exactly that bit about full agency. So although Adam's a liberal, he's actually not a liberal. If you read the book, it's in some ways, illiberal. I mean, the example, and you might want to come back on this, the example you give about whooping cough vaccinations, where you say, there's a headline in the paper saying 7 people died from this vaccination, and there's no kind of counterbalance. And because I was intrigued by it.
I don't advocate for any of those interventions, though.
What you said was, but we should regulate the media, quote, with the appropriate degree of attention should be given to harms of not vaccinating.
Yeah.
And you're going to regulate for that in the media. Whoa.
Well,
I mean,
hold on.
Whoa.
I say that fits within the parameters of budgeting. I don't advocate for everything. Every budget requires a public discussion to see whether it's legitimate. But as long as it fits within the parameters, it's okay by me.
Okay. Because I think it's...
Last question I think I'm going to give to you.
I have a question regarding at what point do you think that it's not legitimate to intervene anymore once we consider that the person has full information, that we've had all these policies, and yet they still don't want to change their behavior?
I think that goes back to your question, yeah. What are the limits of government paternalism?
Zero limits, right? For government paternalism, I'm saying. But it's not
I'm just trying to get my... So you're thinking of... Give me an example.
Yeah.
Okay, someone in my family
Yeah.
had a 95% arteries clogged and family history of people dying from heart attacks.
Yeah.
And after this, he still has all the information, healthcare is accessible,
Yeah.
but he still doesn't want to change his nutrition behavior. So the question is, what can we do, if that's his decision?
Yeah. And I think the answer is there might be things which mean that he's behaving that way because, to give the title of Son Steve's book, it's simple. That's the simple thing to do. So you can create ways of making it, accepting his preferences and finding ways for him to meet those preferences in ways that aren't quite so harmful. And it might be that you can, get him to take some statins and stuff like that. There might be things you could do which he would be completely happy with. So I wouldn't give up on it, but I would say, there are times, it could get us into a debate about assisted dying, for example. There are times when you would kind of want to let individual preferences come through, even though it might, in some kind of utilitarian way, you might think that that's not in their interest, but they think it is. And I think I would be going with the individual's preferences. I wouldn't be trying to change them.
I think really the person, your family, they are the limit of behavioural public policy in the sense that all of the types of interventions we've talked about, they remain fundamentally choice preserving and for people to act in line with their own preferences and desires. And traditionally we've been, this is changing a bit, but primarily looking at the average effect of these types of interventions. I don't think we've ever presented behavioural public policy as something that's quite so targeted at that very individual level, but more something that helps us achieve collective goals in an aggregate sense.
I think if you're a liberal and you have the problem of the addictive gambler or the problem of your putative family person, I think if you're a liberal, what you're concerned with is making sure that you have the conditions in the first place in which people do have full agency. And you should be focusing on that rather than sort of the lasterplaast that comes afterwards when you're trying to putatively operate in their own interests as you then perceive them. You need to focus more on getting the conditions for initial agency right. And then, if you fail in that regard, I think the position of the Liberal is quite straightforward, and that is, we should only be concerned if it turns out that their behaviour harms others. It always harms others, it's not whether you harm yourself. Assuming the initial agency conditions are well satisfied, and you've got that right, then the condition is, do you harm others? If you do harm others, you have a reason to intervene. If you're harming yourself, no.
Can I just ask what you would say, Nava, to that? What would be your answer to your own question?
I think I would say what you were suggesting about making the healthier alternative just more accessible and also just framing it in a better light, because he lives in the US, and very often the unhealthy options are just the more accessible ones and also just more affordable. So I think it would kind of be choice architecture in that way.
And I think it does give the point being, would the person just dying harm others? Actually, almost certainly yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, you'd be upset. You've already expressed. I can't think. There are very few examples.
Well, let me just say something about that, because I think it goes back to Peter's question about what the sort of litmus test is, because the litmus test, I think, is exactly the one that I suggested, is that you don't have a good reason to intervene if the harm is only to yourself. You only have a good intervention, you only have the good reason to intervene when you're harming others. Now, that raises a real problematic issue, and I think that's what politics should all be about, actually, is defining how we understand what harms are. You can't simply define them personally, otherwise you'll define them strategically for that reason. These have to be publicly stated what constitute harms and decided on through the normal procedures of politics and the legal system. And so, whether in your case, as it were, it's reasonable for you to feel that you are harmed by their behaviour is going to be a matter of public determination. It won't be a question about individual determination, because if it's a matter of individual determination, people will use it strategically. They'll say, I'm harmed, and so you've got to have some public standards of harm. And to answer Peter's question, it seems to me that, and this is the point that Littman was making in a different way, I'll phrase it in this point because of my fascination with him this evening, and that is that, what he's saying is that in a society that is dynamic, where things are changing, actually we have to constantly negotiate what we think harms to other people are. You can never have a sort of fixed notion of that. You constantly be engaging in deciding what those harms are, and that's why we can have a sense of there is this sacrosanct area. But my word, it's extremely complicated to know practically what it is, because you're constantly having to be sure that you've got that public sense of harm well defined, so that you know where you can intervene.
So I'm going to be paternalistic and nudge you all toward harm of drinks outside. But before I do that, I want you to join me in thanking our panel for an excellent presentation.